Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Billi FitzSimons.
And I'm Zara Seidler.
Earlier this week, the Australian government announced it will be sending aircraft, weapons and troops to the Middle East amid the ongoing conflict between the US, Israel and Iran. It has led us to one question. Does that mean that Australia has now entered this war? We're going to explore the answer to that question in today's podcast.
Now, Billi, I feel like we've had discussions for the last week and a half about what is happening in the Middle East, and we've kind of interrogated it from a few different angles. I know today you want to talk about it from a domestic angle, about Australia, our role. Are we playing a role? Before we get to that, though, I do feel like we need to just rehash a bit of the context and maybe provide listeners with the latest on what is actually happening in the Middle East.
The latest is that the US government says that this war is nearly over. So US President Donald Trump said earlier this week that this is a short-term war and that they believe their operation is nearly finished.
Okay.
A day after he said that, the head of the US Department of War, Pete Hegseth, he said that Tuesday would be the most intense day of strikes inside Iran. So those could be conflicting statements, but they could also make sense that, Trump is saying that this is nearly over and it could be considered a final push. It's not really clear. We don't fully know. Obviously, they don't share that information publicly. What they have said is that they believe they are winning this war.
The US.
The US believes that they are winning this war and that they will keep going until they defeat Iran or Iran surrenders. What Iran has said is that they are willing to keep going for as long as is required. So Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi did an interview with the US outlet PBS News earlier this week where he said, and I'm quoting, "We are well prepared to continue attacking them with our missiles as long as needed and as long as it takes." And PBS News asked him if he would be willing to negotiate a ceasefire. And his answer was essentially no. So he said, "I don't think the question of talking with Americans or negotiation with Americans, once again, would be on the table because we have a very bitter experience of talking with Americans." All that to say, it's basically still ongoing. It's very fast moving. There are updates every single day, every single hour. And in terms of how long it will go on for, that is still up in the air.
Okay, so we don't know when this war is going to end, and obviously it's playing out in the Middle East. But then this week we heard information that perhaps brings it a bit closer to home. Billi, can you just talk us through what Anthony Albanese and the Australian government announced this week in reference to the war in the Middle East?
So Tuesday morning, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese holds a press conference where he announces that Australia will be sending aircraft, weapons and troops specifically to the UAE after a conversation he had with their president.
Okay, there's a bit to unpack there. I want to understand why we're sending it to the UAE because we're not sending resources, military resources, to Iran, right?
No.
Okay.
So the reason we're sending it to the UAE is because the UAE has US military bases that have been targeted by Iran in their retaliatory attacks. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can I just interrupt? So we're saying here we are obviously an ally of the US and we are going to support them in the UAE where their bases are being attacked by Iran. We're not getting into Iran and we're not participating in those strikes. We are supporting the defense of those military bases.
Yes. One thing I would say is that in explaining why we are doing this, Albanese really emphasised that we're doing this to defend the Australian population that is in the UAE. He didn't focus on the relationship with the US as much. This is very specific to the UAE.
Gotcha. Do we have a lot of Australians in the UAE?
Yes. So we have about 24,000 of them.
Wow.
Yes.
Way more than I would have thought.
Yes. What I didn't realise, which Albanese said in his press conference, is that the UAE has one of the largest expat populations that we have of Australians anywhere in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
No.
But so just to go back to why it's focused on the UAE. So like I said, Iran has retaliated to the initial attacks by attacking US military bases in the Gulf countries, which are 6 Arab nations that border the Persian Gulf. So that includes countries like the UAE. It also includes Saudi Arabia, Qatar, other countries as well. I will quickly point out what's important here is to say that whilst Iran has said that they are attacking US military bases, we have seen that some of their strikes, some of their missiles have hit civilian infrastructure, for example, the Dubai airport. And that has been a focus here, that it's not just US military bases being hit. And something to just point out there that the same is true on the other side. We know that in the initial attacks from the US and Israel, there was a school that was hit. There is debate about whether or not that was a US missile or not. It looks like some evidence says that it was. That's just a side note to say that there are civilians being killed in this war. And that is part of the reason why Australia is sending resources over.
Okay. And you said that we're sending aircraft and that we were sending – what else did you say we were sending?
We're sending aircraft, troops, so people, and weapons.
Okay. What do you mean by sending troops? Because presumably that doesn't mean that Australian troops are going to start walking the streets of Dubai. What does it mean?
Hey, I'm Sam. I'm the co-founder of TDA. With one button, 82% of you who aren't subscribed to this YouTube channel can change that and help Australian media. Click subscribe. Now back to the video.
No, so the reason we're sending troops is to be part of a crew that is part of a plane that we're sending. So, Albanese said that Australia is deploying an E-7A Wedgetail.
Oh, of course.
And it is sending 85 people who will go with that aircraft as part of the crew.
So they're not troops on the ground, they're troops in the air?
They're troops in the air for parts of it, but they will be in the UAE. Obviously, they can't be on the plane for the whole time. This is a 4-week operation that Albanese has said the plane will be in the UAE for. So they will, of course, have to be on the ground at some point. But what's crucial here is that Australia is not sending troops on the ground in Iran. It is just in the UAE.
Okay, can I just ask though, does anyone have troops on the ground in Iran? Does the US have troops on the ground in Iran?
No, there has been no ground invasion in Iran.
Of US or Israeli troops?
Exactly. There have just been missiles being shot from other countries that have US military bases or Israeli military bases that have gone to Iran, but there's no ground invasion.
Okay, and so then that makes sense why it's not a conversation right now about Australia sending troops if US troops are not on the ground.
But the other clarification is that Australia is sending these resources only to defend the UAE.
And Australian citizens specifically in the UAE.
Exactly.
Okay, so these troops are being sent to the UAE to protect Australian citizens there, and they are being deployed to operate a military thing that I've already forgotten the name of.
An E-7A Wedgetail.
What is that?
So I had to look this up. Basically, it's a very advanced military aircraft. It's the size of a Boeing 737, which is a commercial passenger plane, but it is fitted for defense purposes. And how I've understood it is it's basically used for coordination purposes instead of used for shooting missiles from it, for example. It's a coordination tool, and it's able to look at what's happening in the air, in the sea, on land, and coordinate attacks in defense of any incoming attacks.
I understand that, but you did say, though, that we were sending missiles. So even if that's not the aircraft that is executing that, we still are sending missiles.
Exactly. So separate to the aircraft and the troops that we are sending as part of that aircraft, we are also sending missiles.
Okay.
So what we're sending is they're called advanced medium range air-to-air missiles. So those will be missiles that will be given to the UAE on behalf of the Australian government again, they are saying this is purely for the purpose of protecting Australian people and also, they say, their friend, the UAE, from missiles that are coming from Iran. And that's one thing that when I watched the press conference with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and the Defence Minister Richard Marles, they really tried to emphasize, I would say that they were at pains to emphasize that all of these resources they are sending are only there for defensive reasons.
When we talk about how a missile can be used defensively, because it's an interesting idea, we're talking about shooting down incoming missiles, for example. So not sending missiles to Iran, for example, but it is the idea that if Iran, as they have in the past, were to attack the UAE, that they would have a method to defend themselves, and the Australian government is supporting them in doing that.
Exactly.
Okay.
I guess to put it really simply, if there was a missile coming to the UAE, they would have another missile to stop that from hitting the country.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Given that, has there been any pushback by political players against this decision by the Australian government?
Yes. So the Greens have been very critical of it. So Greens Defence spokesperson David Shoebridge said the government's announcement, quote, will only escalate an illegal conflict that's already spiralling out of control and leave Australia trapped in yet another forever war. So those are the concerns here, that this will be a super long-term war and that Australia is now kind of entering it, although I guess the Australian government would dispute whether or not we are now part of this war. They would say that we're not because, again, we're only in the UAE, but I'll leave that there. On the other side, the coalition, they have supported this. They have said that this is defensive deployment. This is what the Australian government has needed to do in order to protect the Australian civilians that are in Dubai, are in UAE, and they're in support of it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I was reading just before we walked in that the Australian government has pulled diplomats from the Australian embassy in Tel Aviv. So there are now very few diplomatic channels that are there for citizens who might still be in the Middle East but trying to leave. And so this is just an interesting layer on top of everything else. Billi, thank you very much for explaining that.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back later today with the headlines, but until then, have a great day.